The way to do the president is to start out with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Then you add a little John Wayne. Here we go. Let's go over the ridge. You put them together. You got George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
In 1989, George Bush became the first sitting vice president to win a presidential election since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Bush helped secure his victory with a bold campaign pledge.
Read my lips. No new taxes. And we've got to hold that line.
What was important at that point in time was to sound decisive. It could have been read my lips, I will stand up to the Soviet Union, or read my lips, I will shop at Walmart. It really didn't matter. It was decisive.
Number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, 1989 to 1993, 64 years old, from Texas. George Bush's resume was long and distinguished. He had been a two-term congressman from Texas, a UN ambassador, and was the first president to have been head of the CIA. Bush was a New Englander by birth, but spent much of his adult life in Texas. He was a Yale man known for loyalty to his friends and a competitive streak that carried over from sports into politics.
Oh, get him.
Bush's opponents seized upon his preppy image and characterized him as a wimp.
You know, the wimp factor really isn't fair, because this is a man who is a World War II hero, who got blown out of his airplane, almost died serving his country. George Bush is many things. A wimp is simply not one of them.
With his management style, Bush set out to show that he was more engaged than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan.
Bush drove everybody crazy trying to keep up with him in the White House.
He was basically a very nice guy and very much a centrist in a way. He really liked to govern the country, based on consensus.
Bush's presidency was defined by two major foreign policy events, the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. In both instances, he displayed his deftness for patient diplomacy. But as the free world cheered the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, President Bush was actually criticized for playing it cool.
You don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking
I'm
of the
elated. I'm
problem.
just not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased.
There was one politician who said that if it was me in the White House, I'd be dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. I'm glad he wasn't. Bush instinctively knew that for bigger and better things, he was going to need Gorbachev's partnership.
The way to do that was not to stick it in their eye when the Berlin Wall came down, but to continue to work with them so the Cold War would end with a whimper and not with a bang, and that's what President Bush did.
The most difficult test of Bush's presidential leadership began in August of 1990, when Iraqi strongman Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
Unfortunately, Iraq has thus far turned a deaf ear to the voices of peace and reason.
In his public speeches, Bush emphasized the need to respond to the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein, but he had other reasons for taking the country to war.
Look, I've been a member of 4 administrations. In every one of those administrations, we had as a written national security policy that we would go to war to protect the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, if necessary, to protect access to those energy reserves for the West. Well, it was necessary in 1991, and we did it.
In the months leading up to the Gulf War, George Bush worked the phones, enlisting the support of the United Nations and building an international coalition of 34 countries to eject Saddam from Kuwait.
I think that the elder George Bush was the best foreign policy president we've had in my lifetime. He realized it would be wrong and counterproductive for America to try to do the invasion and be responsible for its aftermath without the support not only of our European allies, but of Arab nations in the region. And it was that type of foreign policy, that ability to be an internationalist and to care about other nations and allies, that really set the elder George Bush apart.
We are not here on some exercise. This is a real-world situation. And we're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
After 5.5 weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground war began. Within hours, the Iraqi army was in full retreat from Kuwait. and soldiers were surrendering en masse. Bush now had an opportunity to send troops into Baghdad to topple Saddam's regime, but instead he declared it was mission accomplished. Leaving Saddam in power was a controversial decision, but one about which Bush had no doubts.
Taking Saddam out of power was never one of George Bush's stated war aims. The stated war aim was getting him out of Kuwait.
We tried to get him, of course, during the war, because he was the leader of the Iraqi armed forces. That would have been perfectly legitimate. To get him after the war, we would have had to occupy Iraq, go all the way to Baghdad, and we see today that was not a particularly attractive choice.
After the war, Bush's approval rating soared to 84%. Re-election in 1992 seemed likely. But the deficit spawned by the Reagan years had forced the president to renege on his famous campaign pledge and agree to raise taxes.
Bush betrayed our trust. He raised our taxes.
It may have cost him the election, but it was probably good for the country.
I think one of the great things George Bush did is to go back on that pledge and to make the compromises necessary with the Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill to get us a little bit closer to the path of a balanced budget. That worked, and that helped set the stage for the great economic growth of the 1990s.
Unseated by the charismatic Bill Clinton, President Bush left behind a legacy of political moderation. In the end, he proved to be an able, behind-the-scenes operator and skilled diplomat, but an inadequate salesman of his ideas and policies.